The winter of 1815 descended upon London like a velvet curtain embroidered with frost and starlight. Snow blanketed the city in pristine white, transforming the cobblestone streets into glistening pathways that caught the glow of gas lamps and candle-lit windows. Wreaths of holly and ivy adorned every door, their deep green leaves and scarlet berries speaking of ancient traditions and the promise of warmth against the bitter cold. The scent of cinnamon, cloves, and roasted chestnuts drifted through the air, mingling with the crisp bite of December wind, and everywhere one looked, there were signs that the most magical season of the year had arrived. Yet for Lady Evelyn Ashford, the approach of Christmas brought not joy but a familiar ache that settled deep within her chest, cold and persistent as the frost that clung to her bedroom window each morning. She stood before that very window now, watching the snowflakes dance and twirl in the pale morning light, each one unique and beautiful and destined to melt away before it could ever become something more. Much like her hopes, she thought, with a faint, humorless curve of her lips that never reached her eyes, much like every dream she had ever dared to nurture. At 27 years of age, Evelyn had long since resigned herself to the whispers that followed her through every ballroom and drawing-room in London. Spinster, they called her, though never quite loudly enough for her to confront them directly. On the shelf, poor dear, with such a pretty face and such unfortunate circumstances. She had learned to hold her head high, despite the pitying glances and the cruel remarks that seemed to multiply with each passing season, each Christmas ball, each New Year that arrived without a ring upon her finger or a husband by her side. The truth was far more complicated than society's neat little story of a woman too proud or too peculiar to secure a match. Evelyn knew her own heart, and she knew that she had come dangerously close to making the greatest mistake of her life 5 years ago, when she had been young and naive and foolish enough to believe in the honeyed words of a man who had never deserved her trust. Lord Percival Blackwood had been everything a young debutante was taught to desire: handsome, charming, with a smile that could soften the hardest winter and a laugh that seemed to wrap a room in warmth. His dark hair and laughing eyes had drawn attention wherever he went, and his elegant bow at the start of a dance had made more than one girl's heart flutter. He had courted Evelyn openly during her second season, sending flowers, requesting her hand for dances, calling at Ashford House with such regularity that society had already begun to speculate on the date of their engagement. She had believed in him completely. She had believed him when he said she was unlike any other woman, when he murmured that he adored her quiet intelligence, that he cherished the way she saw beauty in small things, a sprig of holly in a crystal vase, the glow of candlelight upon polished silver, the sound of distant carols drifting on a snowy night. She had believed him when he spoke of a shared future, Christmases spent together before their own hearth, their children hanging paper chains and sugared ornaments upon the tree. And then, one December evening, under garlands of evergreen and mistletoe, he had shattered everything. Evelyn's gaze dropped from the window to the small writing desk by the opposite wall. Upon it lay an envelope of thick, creamy paper, the edges gilded, the royal crest pressed deep into red wax. Even from here she could see the elegant script that named her father, Lord Henry Ashford, and his household among the honoured guests of the upcoming royal Christmas ball. The city, indeed the entire realm, seemed to buzz with anticipation. A grand ball at the palace in the very heart of Christmastide, under chandeliers blazing like captured constellations. Such an event promised spectacle, intrigue, and more than a few carefully arranged matches. It was the sort of night on which reputations might be cemented or destroyed, where a single dance could change the course of a life. It was also, Evelyn suspected, the sort of night her cousin Cassandra lived for. Her lips tightened slightly, a small movement that would have gone unnoticed by anyone but herself. Cassandra. The name alone was enough to bring a prickle of tension to the back of her neck, as though she could feel the other woman's gaze upon her even now, sharp and assessing and always amused. Lady Cassandra Whitmore was everything society praised without question. Golden-haired, blue-eyed, possessed of a laugh that tinkled like silver bells, and a manner that suggested sweetness even when she was at her most ruthless. She was a creature made for ballrooms, for rooms filled with flattering candlelight and admiring glances, for gossip that turned on her every word and gesture. Men flocked to her as if drawn by gravity. Women gathered around her to bask in reflected glitter. Cassandra, who had once pretended to be Evelyn's friend. Cassandra, who had listened to her speak of Lord Percival's courtship with soft, sympathetic eyes and gentle smiles. Cassandra, who had appeared upon the Whitmore staircase at their Christmas ball 5 years ago, with her hand upon Percival's arm and triumph blazing in her gaze. Evelyn's fingers curled lightly at her sides as the memory rose again, unbidden, unwelcome, yet stubbornly vivid. The Whitmore ballroom had been a glittering vision of Christmas splendor. Garlands of pine and holly draped along the walls, crimson ribbons trailing like streams of frozen wine, crystal ornaments catching the light and scattering it into 1,000 points. The musicians had played carols woven between country dances and waltzes, and the scent of beeswax, mulled wine, and evergreens had mingled in the warm air. She had stood near the edge of the room, smoothing the skirt of her pale blue gown, her heart beating a little too quickly. She had been waiting for Percival, eager and nervous in equal measure, certain he would come straight to her, that he would ask for the first waltz. That night she had thought might be the night he finally spoke to her father, the night her future took shape like a figure stepping forth from the snowy mist. Instead, the crowd had parted, and Cassandra had descended upon Percival's arm. The sight had stolen Evelyn's breath so thoroughly she had swayed where she stood. Cassandra's gown had been a shimmering white, trimmed with silver thread, as if she were a snow queen come to life. Diamonds flashed at her throat and ears, casting tiny rainbows against her creamy skin whenever she turned her head. Percival had been the very picture of a debonair gentleman, his black hair perfectly arranged, his smile easy and content as he looked down at the woman beside him. No one, Evelyn remembered, had looked at her at all. There had been no quiet explanation later, no embarrassed apology. Gossip filled in the silence. Some said Cassandra had cleverly placed herself in Percival's path, that her father's influence and wealth had made the match irresistible. Others hinted at stolen kisses in the shadows, at moments engineered so perfectly that the gentleman's honor had been forced to bend. Whatever the truth, the result had been the same. Lord Percival Blackwood, once the suitor who had filled Evelyn's heart with Christmas dreams, had become Cassandra's conquest instead, and Cassandra had wasted no time in twisting the knife. "Still without a husband, dearest Evelyn," she had murmured later that night, her tone full of false concern, her eyes bright with mockery. "Do not fret. Not everyone is destined to be a duchess or a viscountess. Some of us must simply learn to be content with less." The words had clung to Evelyn like a burr, the cruel refrain echoing through the years that followed. Still without a husband, still waiting, still the object of speculation, pity, or amusement in every drawing room where Cassandra chose to mention her. Evelyn had survived the humiliation. She had learned to endure the whispers, to ignore the glances. She had buried the girl who believed in Percival's promises and in the uncomplicated magic of Christmas dreams, and in her place had grown a woman who used her mind and her composure as armor. Yet even armor could feel heavy in December, when every glittering bauble and every burst of laughter seemed to remind her of what she had lost and what others believed she would never have. She turned away from the window at last, the hem of her morning gown whispering against the carpet as she crossed back toward her writing desk. The invitation lay where she had left it earlier, its presence both a temptation and a threat. She picked it up with careful fingers, letting her gaze drift once more over the elegant lines naming the time and place of the royal Christmas ball. The palace, Christmas, all of society. Cassandra, without question. Percival, almost certainly. And somewhere among them, the observing eyes of those who delighted in watching her stumble. Evelyn's jaw firmed. It would be easier, she knew, to feign an illness, to beg off the event with some vague complaint, to claim a chill or a sick headache. Her father would worry, of course, and he might suspect, but he would not force her to attend if she truly insisted she could not. She could pass the evening in her own chamber with a book and a tray brought up from the kitchens, listening distantly to the carriage wheels rattling past outside as others made their way to the palace. She could hide, but she was so very tired of hiding. 5 years ago, she had allowed Cassandra's betrayal and Percival's faithlessness to drive her inward, to make her shrink from the world that had laughed as she bled. She had retreated to the safety of Ashford House, confined herself to smaller gatherings, chosen to spend more evenings by the fire with her father than in the crowded parlours where gossip swirled like snow in a storm. There had been comfort in that, in the gentle routine of home and the quiet rhythms of domestic Christmases. Yet somewhere inside her, a part of the girl she had once been still stirred restlessly, still yearned for something more than survival and dignity. She wanted, against all rational arguments, something like wonder, something like the glow of a Christmas candle held in cupped hands while the rest of the world stood in darkness. The royal Christmas ball, she thought, might well be a battlefield, but it might also be a turning point. A knock sounded at her chamber door, crisp and polite. She set the invitation down and smoothed her skirts before calling, "Come in." The door opened to admit Alice, her maid, a sensible young woman with capable hands and an expression that tended toward worry whenever her mistress appeared too pensive. "Begging your pardon, my lady," Alice said, closing the door behind her. "Cook sent me up to see if you fancied a bit more chocolate before it cools, and your father asked if you would join him in the drawing-room shortly. There's a delivery from the palace he thought you might like to see." Evelyn arched a brow. "Another delivery?" "Yes, my lady," Alice replied, her eyes bright with the thrill of news. "A footman arrived not half an hour ago. There was such a flutter below stairs, you'd have thought the king himself had come for tea." A faint amusement tugged at Evelyn's mouth. And did the servants manage not to faint outright? "Only because Cook threatened to put anyone who dropped a tray on pudding duty for the rest of the week," Alice said, allowing herself a small smile. "Will you come down, my lady?" Lord Ashford seemed, well, excited. Her father's excitement where royal matters were concerned was as reliable as the turning of the year. Evelyn felt a flicker of fondness warm her chest. "Yes," she said at last. "I will come presently. Help me change into something more suitable, if you please. Papa will be scandalized if I meet a royal delivery in an old morning gown." Alice set to work at once, her fingers deft as she helped Evelyn into a gown of deep red, trimmed with subtle gold embroidery, a colour that made her pale skin luminous and echoed the hues of holly berries and Christmas ribbons. As the fabric settled around her, Evelyn felt strangely as though she were donning not merely a garment, but a resolution. She would attend the royal Christmas ball. She would face Cassandra's smirk and society's whispers, and perhaps, though she scarcely dared think it, perhaps the night would bring something she had never expected. Not a miracle. She no longer believed in those, but a shift, a change, a quiet act of courage that might, over time, become its own kind of magic. When she descended to the drawing-room, Lord Ashford was standing near the fireplace, spectacles perched upon his nose as he peered at something resting on the mantel. The room itself was a haven of Christmas warmth, a tall fir tree, bedecked with ribbons, dried oranges and tiny silver stars, stood near the window. The fire crackled merrily, and a bowl of polished red apples gleamed upon the sideboard. "Ah, Evelyn, my dear," her father exclaimed as she entered. "Come, come, see what has arrived from the palace. It seems the king intends to outdo himself in spectacle this year, a most delightful tradition." She crossed the room, her gaze following his gesture. Upon the mantel lay a smaller envelope, likewise bearing the royal crest, but this one was addressed in a different hand, curling, elegant and unfamiliar. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "A supplemental note, it seems," Lord Ashford said, removing his spectacles and polishing them on his handkerchief. "To certain invited guests. Your name is mentioned specifically." Her heart gave a small startled jolt. "Mine? Indeed. Read it, my dear. My eyes are not what they once were, and I should not like to misinterpret anything from the crown." Evelyn broke the seal with careful fingers and unfolded the heavy paper. The message inside was brief, but as she read, she felt a strange ripple pass through her, like the faint tremor that runs ahead of a storm. The note expressed the king's desire that certain ladies of unblemished reputation and good family be accorded particular honor at the ball, as a gesture of royal favor in this season of peace and goodwill. These ladies would be presented to several high-ranking noblemen, known for their service, loyalty, and unimpeachable character. Her gaze lingered on one name, His Grace, Alexander Thorne, Duke of Everthorne, the most powerful duke in the realm, widely respected, distant, and a figure of some mystery among the ton, a man spoken of in the same hushed, awe-tinged tones reserved for great victories and great fortunes. It was said he seldom attended balls, that he disdained the frivolity of gossip-laden rooms and preferred the solitude of his northern estate. And yet the king had called him to this Christmas ball, and the king now indicated that Lady Evelyn Ashford was among the ladies to be presented to him. Her fingers tightened slightly upon the paper. "Good news, I trust?" Lord Ashford asked, peering at her with hopeful eyes. "It is—" Evelyn paused, searching for the right words. "It is an honor, Papa. The king intends that I be presented to a few noblemen of consequence during the ball." Her father's face lit with genuine delight. "Does he indeed? Splendid, splendid. I knew the invitation boded well. A royal Christmas ball, and now this. Ha, Evelyn, my girl, you see. The world has not forgotten you, nor it seems has Providence." Providence, she thought, had a curious sense of timing. She folded the note carefully and set it back upon the mantel. Somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed the hour, their sound clear and cold through the winter air. The fire popped, sending a tiny cascade of sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow continued to fall. Later, alone again in her chamber, Evelyn stood once more by the window and looked out upon the white-draped city. The royal Christmas ball loomed before her, now not as a vague possibility, but as an inescapable appointment. Cassandra would be there, gleaming in diamonds and arrogance. Percival would be there, no doubt as charming and unworthy as ever. And somewhere within that blazing ballroom, beneath chandeliers that shone like constellations and wreaths that filled the air with the scent of pine and orange, the Duke of Everthorne would stand. She knew little about him beyond the rumors. The immense wealth, the influence at court, the reputation for honor that clung to his name. Some called him aloof, others stern. Many speculated about the reasons for his reserve. A broken heart, a family tragedy, a simple preference for solitude. Whatever the truth, he seemed an unlikely participant in the glittering games of courtship that occupied so much of London's attention. Yet the king had summoned him for Christmas, and the king had marked Evelyn for his notice. She touched the glass lightly, her breath leaving a faint mist upon it. "Very well," she murmured into the quiet, her voice steady. "Let this Christmas come, then. Let the ball take place. Let them whisper. Let Cassandra jeer. I will go." The snow fell. The bells tolled in the distance. In another part of London, preparations were already underway at the palace, floors polished to a mirror shine, branches of holly and mistletoe hung in strategic arches, candles counted and polished and made ready to burn far into the winter night. And somewhere a man who had not yet met her, who did not yet know how his life would entwine with hers beneath those glittering chandeliers, considered the king's summons, the weight of duty, and the curious tug of a season that promised miracles he no longer believed in. When Christmas came, and the royal ball with it, the world would laugh at Evelyn Ashford for waiting. But she was not waiting for any man. Without knowing it, she had been waiting for the right one. The night of the royal Christmas ball arrived dressed in silver and firelight. Snow still powdered the rooftops of London, but the sky above the city had cleared into a deep crystalline indigo scattered with stars, as though the heavens themselves had chosen to gaze down upon the palace. Lanterns flared along the grand avenue that led to the royal residence, their golden light reflecting off the frost that clung to iron railings and stone steps. Carriages rolled steadily toward the great gates, wheels crunching softly over the thin layer of snow, horses' breath steaming in the cold. Inside one of those carriages, Lady Evelyn Ashford sat very straight, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap. The interior smelled faintly of leather, beeswax, and the delicate violet water she had dabbed at her wrists and throat. Opposite her, Lord Ashford regarded his daughter with a mixture of pride and quiet concern, his lined face softened by the flickering light of the carriage lamps. "You look very well, my dear," he said at last, his voice gentle. "Very well indeed. That colour becomes you." Evelyn inclined her head, lips curving in a composed smile. "Thank you, Papa." Her gown was a deep, rich green, as dark as pine needles in shadow, with a sheen that caught the light whenever she moved. Fine gold embroidery traced patterns of holly leaves along the hem and sleeves, and tiny garnets like scattered berries glimmered at intervals along the bodice. Her hair had been arranged with care by Alice, swept up in an elegant chignon with a few soft curls framing her face, and adorned with a delicate comb shaped like a snowflake, its crystals catching every glint. She looked, she supposed, precisely as a lady should at a royal ball, polished, festive, appropriate. If only her heart felt as steady as her appearance suggested. Outside the small window, the palace loomed nearer with every turn of the wheels. Its vast facade rose against the night, each window blazing with warm light, each column and balustrade wreathed with evergreen garlands and red ribbons. Torches flamed in tall iron brackets, their light mingling with that of new gas lamps so that the entire building seemed to glow like a great hearth in the center of the city. Carriages ahead of them rolled beneath the archway and into the courtyard, where liveried footmen waited in precise ranks, ready to open doors and offer gloved hands to the guests. The sound of music, strings and flutes, and a distant swell of voices floated faintly on the air each time the doors were opened. "Are you nervous?" her father asked quietly. There was no point pretending otherwise. "A little," she admitted. "It is a great deal of spectacle for one evening." "It is, yes," he said, smiling faintly. "But you are equal to it, remember that." She gave him a grateful glance, then redirected her gaze out the window as their carriage moved forward. She had not told him everything, not about the note on the mantel that had named her among those to be presented to the Duke of Everthorne, nor about the thread of apprehension that wound around that knowledge. Her father had enough to occupy his mind without borrowing her anxieties. It was enough that he knew she would be introduced to noblemen of consequence. He did not need the weight of particular expectations. The carriage drew to a halt at last. A footman's shout, the muffled thud of boots, the creak of the door's hinges, and then cold air slipped into the compartment as the night rushed in. Lord Ashford stepped out first, descending to the carpeted step that had been placed outside. He turned, offering his hand, and Evelyn placed her gloved fingers lightly in his, allowing him to help her down. For a moment, as her feet touched the ground, she simply stood and took it in. The courtyard was alive with motion and color, carriages arriving, plumes shaking, footmen bowing, ladies' gowns shimmering like snow, ice, rubies, and midnight. The facade of the palace towered above them, every window a square of warm light. Evergreen ropes hung from the balconies, intertwined with sparkling ornaments and bunches of mistletoe tied with red ribbon. A massive fir tree, nearly reaching the second floor, stood in one corner of the courtyard, its branches ablaze with candles protected by glass globes. The flames, flickering like a constellation, brought down to earth. Music, brighter and clearer now, spilled out through the open doors. The swell of an orchestra tuning, the murmur of a waltz laced with hints of familiar Christmas melodies. Evelyn drew a breath, letting the cold air fill her lungs. It smelled of snow, horses, and faintly of pine. Her heart beat a little faster. "Shall we?" her father asked. "Yes," she said. "Let us not keep the king waiting." They mounted the steps together, passing between pairs of guards in gleaming uniforms and tall plumed hats. The great doors opened before them, and warmth enveloped them at once, physical, from the countless fires and candles, and sensory, from the swell of sound and scent. The entrance hall was a marvel of Christmas pageantry. Marble floors reflected the glitter of chandeliers overhead, each one hung with crystal drops that caught the candlelight. Garlands of holly and ivy twined along the balustrades of the sweeping staircase, and wreaths adorned the walls, their ribbons trailing gracefully. Footmen in royal livery moved with practiced coordination, directing guests toward the receiving line or onto the ballroom beyond. Evelyn had attended balls at noble houses before, but never anything like this. The air thrummed with a peculiar mixture of excitement and reverence, as if everyone present felt, on some level, that they were stepping into a night that would be remembered long after the fires burned low. They joined the line of guests waiting to be announced. Names rang out one after another, as the herald's voice carried dukes, marquises, ambassadors, foreign dignitaries, ladies, lords. The sound seemed to pulse through the walls, echoing faintly down the corridor toward the ballroom, a roll call of the realm's most glittering names. "Courage, Evelyn," Lord Ashford murmured, patting her hand where it rested upon his arm. She offered him a small, steady smile. Their turn came sooner than she expected. The herald took their card, his eyes flicking over it, and then his voice rang out, clear and ceremonious. "Lord Henry Ashford, Viscount Ashford, and Lady Evelyn Ashford." The title and name floated into the air, joining all the others as they stepped forward. They entered the ballroom, and for a moment Evelyn forgot to breathe. It was as if someone had taken every romantic notion of Christmastide and given it shape in crystal, gold, and evergreen. The room was vast, its high-arched ceiling painted with scenes of myth and victory, now haloed in the soft glow of hundreds, no, thousands of candles. Chandeliers hung like illuminated snowflakes, each crystal dripping light. The walls were lined with mirrors framed in gilded scrollwork, reflecting the guests and multiplying the sense of space and shimmer. Garlands of pine and holly swathed the columns, intertwined with scarlet and gold ribbons. In great urns at intervals around the walls, arrangements of winter flowers, evergreen branches and ribbons formed luxurious bursts of color. Strategically placed above doorways and alcoves, sprigs of mistletoe hung, their white berries gleaming mischievously. At one end of the room, the musicians were gathered upon a raised platform, violins, cellos, flutes, and horns, already playing a graceful waltz that carried hints of familiar Christmas tunes woven through the melody. At the opposite end, upon a dais, 2 grand chairs stood, one for the king, one for the queen, both draped with banners and flanked by tall candelabra. The air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the swish of satin and silk. Jewels flashed, fans fluttered, gloved hands gestured delicately as gossip began to flow over the room like a quietly rising tide. Evelyn's first instinct was to withdraw to the edge of the floor, to find a place along the wall where she might observe without drawing undue attention. But the night, she reminded herself, was not meant for hiding. Not this time. Still, she allowed her father to guide her to one side, where they could gather their bearings for a moment. "The king and queen will make their entrance shortly," Lord Ashford said. "Then the opening dances, and after that, the presentations." His eyes sparkled behind his spectacles. "You must be prepared, my dear, they will be looking for you." She managed a faint chuckle. "I suspect they will be looking for many people tonight." "And you will nevertheless be among them," he replied. As they spoke, more guests swept into the ballroom. Evelyn recognized several familiar faces, ladies and gentlemen she had encountered over the years at various gatherings, though she saw at once how many eyes slid over her with polite indifference before sharpening with interest upon others. And then, like a shard of ice sliding into her veins, she saw Cassandra. Lady Cassandra Whitmore stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a cluster of admirers. Her gown tonight was a masterpiece of excess, shimmering white silk overlaid with a filmy layer of silver-spangled tulle, catching the candlelight with every movement so that she appeared wrapped in starlight. Diamonds adorned her throat, ears and hair, which had been coaxed into artful curls that framed her face. She threw back her head and laughed at something a young lord said, her fan flicking open like a theatrical cue. Her eyes, a bright, icy blue, swept the room and found Evelyn. For an instant their gazes locked. Cassandra's smile deepened, a slow, feline expression that promised mischief at best and cruelty at worst. She murmured something to her companions, who turned to follow her line of sight. Evelyn saw, in quick succession, curiosity, recognition, and amusement flicker in their faces. Her stomach tightened, but she forced herself not to look away. "She will not see me flinch," Evelyn told herself. "Not tonight." Cassandra inclined her head in a mocking little nod, then turned back to her group, dismissing Evelyn as easily as one might dismiss a servant. "Odious girl," Lord Ashford muttered under his breath, following his daughter's line of sight. "If she were not family, I should... well, it is no use wishing things otherwise. Pay her no mind, Evelyn. She has less power over you than she imagines." Evelyn said nothing. Power, she thought, was not always in what one actually held, but in what others believed one held. Cassandra believed she still had the power to wound, Evelyn was not entirely certain she was wrong. Before the weight of that thought could settle too heavily upon her, a ripple passed through the room. Conversations softened, people turned toward the dais. The musicians shifted seamlessly into a stately air. The king and queen were entering. They processed in with the easy dignity of long habit, flanked by attendants, and followed by a small group of royal relatives and distinguished guests. The king, a solid figure with kind eyes, wore a coat of deep crimson trimmed with gold, while the queen's gown was a cascade of white and red, like snow touched with holly berries. They took their seats upon the dais and surveyed the assembled crowd. After the requisite bows and curtsies from the guests, the first dances began. Partners were drawn onto the floor, and the ballroom filled with twirling colors and patterns, the structured grace of the waltz overlaying the exuberant undercurrent of holiday joy. Evelyn stood with her father watching, her mind half upon the dancers and half upon the inevitability of what lay ahead. She did not have to wait long. A royal equerry approached them, bowing respectfully. "Lord Ashford, Lady Evelyn, their majesties will soon begin the presentations. If you would be so good as to wait just here, you will be summoned presently." Lord Ashford inclined his head. "Of course." The equerry retreated, leaving them in a small eddy of stillness amid the moving crowd. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened. "Remember," her father murmured, "this is an honor. Whatever else transpires tonight, that fact remains." She nodded. A few moments later, another set of steps echoed on the marble. This time, the shift in the room was subtler, but no less real. Heads turned toward the far side of the ballroom, where the great doors had opened once more to admit a new arrival. Evelyn, curious despite herself, followed their gaze. A tall figure in black and deep midnight blue entered, accompanied by a quiet murmur that seemed to ripple outward from the doors like the wake of a ship. Alexander Thorne, Duke of Everthorne. Even from across the room, he drew the eye with a force that had very little to do with the cut of his coat or the precision of his cravat, though both were impeccable. He stood head and shoulders above many of the men nearby, his shoulders broad beneath his dark coat, his posture relaxed yet alert. His hair, a deep brown that might have looked unremarkable on another man, seemed somehow to suit his coloring perfectly, and there was a faint hint of silver at his temples that lent distinction rather than age. But it was his face that caught her breath for a moment, strong, clean lines, a firm mouth, and eyes that, even at this distance, seemed steady and piercing. He did not smile as he entered. His expression was composed, polite, but not effusive. And yet the room shifted around him, subtly acknowledging the weight of his presence. He bowed to the king and queen upon reaching the dais, speaking a few words that did not carry far enough for Evelyn to hear. The queen's face brightened with pleasure. The king nodded, clearly satisfied that the duke had responded to the summons. "Everthorne," Lord Ashford murmured, following her gaze. "I have not seen him at a ball in years. This must truly mean a great deal to His Majesty." Evelyn said nothing. She could not have explained to her father that seeing the man whose name had been written in the royal note made everything suddenly, sharply real. The duke did not linger at the dais. After the necessary courtesies, he stepped down and took up a position slightly apart from the densest crowd. Several gentlemen approached him in turn, clearly eager to exchange greetings or curry favor, but he received them with the same polite reserve with which he had entered, giving nothing away easily. He did not dance. He watched. Evelyn felt an odd, inexplicable sense of kinship in that, not in his rank or history of which she knew nothing real, but in his posture at the edge of things, seeing more than those who plunged too eagerly into the swirl. She had no time to linger on the thought. The equerry returned, gesturing to them. "If you please, Lady Evelyn, His Majesty will see you now." Her throat went dry. She moved forward alongside her father, aware of the subtle shift in attention around them. A royal presentation at a ball of this magnitude was hardly a private affair. Glances followed them as they approached the dais, curious and assessing. She dropped into a deep curtsy before the king and queen, the movements drilled into her since girlhood. Her skirts fanned out around her in a sweep of evergreen and gold. "Lady Evelyn Ashford," the equerry intoned. "Rise, my dear," the queen said kindly. "We are pleased to see you this evening." Evelyn rose, keeping her gaze respectfully lowered until the moment etiquette allowed her to meet the Queen's eyes. There was warmth there and interest. "Your Majesties honour me," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the strange fluttering in her chest. The king gave a small, approving nod. "Your father served the crown faithfully, and you have conducted yourself with dignity in trying circumstances. It is fitting you should enjoy the full measure of the season's hospitality." The words, though general, carried an undercurrent that told her he knew more of her story than she might have wished. Heat touched her cheeks. "Your Majesty is very gracious," she managed. The Queen's gaze softened further. "There are gentlemen here tonight who understand the value of character over gossip, Lady Evelyn. We trust you will make their acquaintance." A subtle gesture from the king, and the equerry stepped forward again. "His Grace, the Duke of Everthorn, if he pleases," the equerry called softly. Evelyn's breath stalled. Somewhere behind her she heard a small stir, the faint rustle of fabric as people turned to see. She stepped aside slightly as the Duke approached the dais. Up close he was even more striking. The candlelight picked out the planes of his face, the faint line between his brows that suggested thoughtfulness or habitual seriousness, the hint of something like weariness in his eyes that did not diminish their intensity. His coat was of the deepest blue, nearly black, with a discreet silver embroidery at the cuffs, and his cravat was tied with simple perfection. He bowed to the king and queen once more, then straightened. Only then did his gaze touch Evelyn. She had the impression in that single moment that he saw her fully. Not only the arrangement of her hair or the cut of her gown, but the tension in her shoulders, the composure held like a fragile pane of glass, the years of quiet endurance etched in the faint tightenings around her mouth and eyes. "Everthorn," the king said, "may we present Lady Evelyn Ashford?" The Duke inclined his head. "Your Majesties do me honour." His attention shifted wholly to Evelyn. "Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice low and warm, with a timbre that reminded her faintly of a hearth-fire on a winter's night. "It is a pleasure." "Your Grace," she replied, curtsying once more. "The pleasure is mine." Their eyes held for a heartbeat. There was no spark of instant attraction in the foolish, romantic sense. If anything, there was something quieter, more unsettling, a recognition of sorts. Two people who had not come for games meeting in a room filled with them. The king's eyes twinkled. "We trust you will not deprive Lady Evelyn of at least one dance this evening, Everthorn. It is Christmastide, after all. Even the most solemn of men must concede to the season's demands from time to time." A faint, almost imperceptible curve touched the Duke's mouth, gone as quickly as it had appeared. "If Lady Evelyn is willing," he said, "I would be honoured to dance with her." Evelyn felt her pulse leap. She had not expected this, not so soon, not so publicly. "I should be glad to accept, Your Grace," she answered, surprised at how calm she sounded, as if her voice belonged to some other woman who moved as unhurriedly as falling snow. "Excellent," the Queen declared. "Then let the season work its gentle magic." The presentation concluded, and they were dismissed with the appropriate courtesies. Evelyn stepped back, aware that eyes followed her more openly now. To be presented to the Duke of Everthorn by the king himself, and immediately promised a dance by such a man, it was the sort of moment that would feed the gossips for weeks. As they moved away from the dais, Lord Ashford's hand closed lightly but firmly over hers. "Very well done, my dear," he said softly. "Very well done indeed." Before she could answer, another voice intruded, as smooth and sweet as sugared wine and twice as cloying. "Why, Evelyn, I had begun to wonder if you had taken up permanent residence in the shadows." "Cassandra." Evelyn turned to face her cousin. Up close, Cassandra's gown was even more extravagant than it had appeared from across the room, tiny crystals sewn into the fabric so that each movement sent a shower of light shimmering across her figure. Her lips were painted the precise shade of winter berries, her cheeks flushed just enough to suggest excitement. Her pale blue eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Lady Cassandra," Evelyn said, inclining her head, "good evening." "Such formality between family," Cassandra chided with a laugh, "and on Christmas no less. How heartless you are, dear cousin." Lord Ashford's jaw tightened. "Cassandra," he said coldly, "this is neither the time nor the place." On the contrary, she replied, her voice light. It is precisely the time and place. After all, what are balls but occasions for conversation and reacquaintance? Cassandra's gaze flicked pointedly to Evelyn's father, then back to Evelyn. For a moment her eyes narrowed slightly, as if measuring something. I could not help but notice, Cassandra went on, that you were being presented just now, Evelyn. How very fortunate, and to such lofty company. She lowered her voice just enough that only those immediately around them could hear, though Evelyn knew the volume was calculated perfectly to be carried to nearby ears if anyone cared to listen. Of course, one must seize what one can. Not everyone is so blessed with opportunities. Evelyn met her gaze without flinching. Indeed, opportunities come in many forms. Some of them even prove to be blessings in disguise. For a fraction of a second, Cassandra's smile tightened. The mention of blessing in disguise clearly recalled Lord Percival, though neither of them had spoken his name. Ah, Cassandra said smoothly. Lord Percival sends his regards, by the way. He mentioned you only yesterday. So fondly. Her tone made the word into a small, precise weapon. He was saying how kind it is of you to have remained so constant in your circumstances. It provides such a reassuring sense of continuity. Don't you think? Lord Percival's regard was worth less to Evelyn now than a broken ornament, but the deliberate cruelty in Cassandra's phrasing was unmistakable. Her cousin was building towards something. Evelyn could feel it in the tightening of the conversational noose. I am glad Lord Percival finds comfort somewhere, Evelyn replied evenly. We must all draw reassurance where we can. Cassandra's eyes flashed. The polite fencing was not enough for her. She wanted blood. Her fan snapped open with a soft whiff of air. Well, she said brightly, pitching her voice just a shade louder, at least we can be certain of one thing, can we not? She tipped her head, feigning innocence. Still without a husband, are you, dear Evelyn? The words dropped into the air like a stone into still water. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to go very quiet around them. The music continued. Dancers twirled. But in the immediate circle near Evelyn and Cassandra, conversation faltered. A few fans paused mid-flutter. Eyes flicked toward them, bright with avid curiosity. Lord Ashford stiffened beside his daughter. Colour rose in his cheeks, his hand tightening upon his cane. Cassandra, he said sharply, you go too far. But Cassandra was not looking at him. She was looking at Evelyn, her expression the very picture of sympathy, etched in porcelain. Oh, forgive me, she cooed, though there was not a trace of remorse in her tone. I forget sometimes that certain topics may be sensitive. It is only that one hears things, you know. One wonders if perhaps you have grown too choosy, or if it is merely that no gentleman is willing to take such a... It was then that the room itself seemed to intervene. From somewhere behind Evelyn, footsteps sounded, deliberate, unhurried, yet carrying with them a curious hush. A subtle awareness passed through those nearby, like the faint shift in air ahead of a snowstorm. Conversations in their immediate vicinity faded further. People turned their heads. Cassandra's words trailed off. Evelyn, sensing the change, felt the hairs at the nape of her neck rise. She became acutely aware of the line of her shoulders, the position of her chin, the way her gown fell around her feet. Every instinct told her not to turn, not to look, not to acknowledge whatever or whoever was approaching until they made their intentions known. The footsteps stopped directly in front of her, a moment of poised silence, as taut as a drawn bowstring. Then a familiar voice, warm and steady, spoke. Lady Evelyn? She looked up. The Duke of Everthorne stood before her. Up close, without the filter of distance or formal presentation, his presence was even more arresting. His eyes, a dark, clear grey, met hers with a focus that excluded the rest of the room. The faint vertical line between his brows was less pronounced now, as though something had quietly eased in his expression. There was no trace of mockery in his gaze, no pity, only a kind of resolute intent. Your Grace, she said, dipping a small curtsy, her voice composed despite the sudden pounding of her heart. Around them, the circle of onlookers widened slightly. Cassandra's fan froze halfway through a motion, her eyes wide with incredulity. The Duke extended his hand, palm open, his gesture precise and unmistakably public. "If you would do me the honor," he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest, "may I have this dance, my Duchess?" The final words seemed to ring in the air. The ballroom, or at least the part of it within earshot, collectively held its breath. My Duchess. The phrase hovered between them, impossible to dismiss as mere slip of the tongue. He had not called her my lady, or Lady Evelyn, or even offered some polite compliment. He had claimed a title for her, one she did not yet bear, before a watching crowd, his tone making it sound less like a jest and more like a promise he had already decided upon. Evelyn's breath caught. For a heartbeat, doubt flickered. Was this a cruel joke, a jest at her expense? But one look into his eyes banished the thought. There was nothing of mockery there, only a grave, almost fierce protectiveness, and something else, something like admiration that startled her even more. He had heard, he had seen, he had chosen, deliberately, to step into the space Cassandra's cruelty had carved and fill it with something new. Behind her, Cassandra faltered. "Your Grace," she began, her voice thinned with shock. "Surely you—" He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed upon Evelyn, his hand still extended, as though nothing and no one else in that moment mattered. The decision was hers. She could refuse, of course. She could step back, retreat, cling to the safety of anonymity and habit. Or she could place her hand in his and step forward, into something she did not yet understand. Evelyn lifted her chin very slightly. She placed her gloved fingers in his open palm. "I would be honored, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying with unexpected clarity. His hand closed firmly but gently around hers. A collective exhale seemed to sigh through the room. Without releasing her, he turned just enough that his words would brush Cassandra as surely as a glove across the face. "You are mistaken, my lady," he said, his tone polite but edged with steel. "Lady Evelyn is not still without a husband, in any sense that concerns you. Some choices are simply not made in haste." A flush rose along Cassandra's cheekbones, stark against her powder. For once she seemed to lack a ready rejoinder. Evelyn did not look back to see more. The Duke led her toward the dance floor, the crowd parting instinctively around them. The musicians, sensing the center of gravity of the room shift, moved seamlessly into the opening strains of another waltz, this one threaded more boldly with a Christmas carol's melody, turning the dance into something like a secular hymn. They stepped into hold, his hand warm at her waist, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, their joined hands poised between them. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, eyes meeting, as the world rearranged itself around them. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly, the words scarcely more than a breath, but carrying more weight than any formal expression could have. "You did not have to—" "I know," he replied, equally quietly. Up close, his voice seemed to hum against her skin, like the vibration of a cello's lowest string. And yet, he guided her into the first turn of the dance. The ballroom spun gently around them, garlands, candles, mirrors, faces. The music swelled, wrapping them in a cocoon of sound. The scent of evergreens and wax and distant spices drifted around them like an invisible wreath. For the first time in many years, Evelyn felt a different kind of awareness in a man's arms, not the shallow thrill she had once known as a girl with Percival, but something deeper, steadier. A sense that this man would not abandon her in the middle of a ballroom, that he would step forward when others stepped back. "Why?" she murmured after a few measures, unable to keep the question entirely silenced. "You scarcely know me." He regarded her with that same steady, searching gaze. "I know enough," he said. "I know what it is to be the subject of speculation, to have one's life made sport at the edge of a dance floor." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "And I know that anyone who can stand as you did, and not cower, is worth at least one dance." Her lips parted slightly. "You were watching, for some time," he said simply. "Forgive me if that sounds presumptuous. I had considered asking you for this dance even before Her Majesty suggested it. Your composure intrigued me." "You call that composure?" she asked, a hint of wryness slipping into her voice despite herself. "From where I stood," he replied, "yes, you did not shrink even with arrows aimed directly at you. Many would have. A pause. I have seen it happen often enough. His hand at her waist was firm, guiding but never possessive. He moved with an easy command of the dance, allowing her space and balance. She found herself relaxing, her steps falling into sync with his. "Then you have my thanks twice over," she said. "Once for the dance, once for the intervention." He inclined his head slightly. "Consider it a Christmas tradition. One small act of justice in a room where it is often in short supply." The waltz carried them past a mirror. For a brief moment, Evelyn caught a glimpse of herself in its polished surface. Her green gown, his dark coat, the way their movements aligned with unstudied grace. They looked, she thought with a strange, almost disbelieving pang, as though they belonged together. My Duchess. He had spoken the words before the entire room. Whether he had meant them as an impulsive shield against Cassandra's cruelty or as something more, she could not yet tell. But the sound of them lingered in her mind, like the echo of a carol, reshaping the air around her. As the waltz drew on, their conversation deepened in small, cautious increments. He asked about her father's service to the crown. She inquired delicately about his northern estates, about the snow and solitude he plainly did not mind. He spoke with quiet affection of the countryside in winter, the stark beauty of bare trees rhymed with frost, the way stars seemed closer, the hush of snow at night. "It sounds almost peaceful," she said. "It is," he replied, "and lonely at times. Peace and loneliness often travel together." She understood that more than she cared to admit. "And you, Lady Evelyn?" he asked. "Do you prefer the bustle of London at Christmastide, or the quiet of the country?" She considered. "I have known both," she said at last. "The bustle can be exhilarating if one feels oneself part of it, but when one does not, it can become merely noise. The country is gentler, I think. The silence is kinder." He regarded her with what she could only describe as approval. "You choose your words carefully," he observed. "Again, that intrigues me." She gave a small, almost self-conscious smile. "I have learned that careless words can cut deeper than sharp ones when spoken often enough. It makes one think twice before adding more noise to the world." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, as though something in her remark touched a nerve. "Yes," he said. "Quite." The music began to soften, the waltz approaching its final measures. Around them other couples slowed, preparing to part with the requisite courtesies before the next dance. Evelyn felt a faint, unexpected reluctance at the thought of releasing his hand, of stepping out once more into the uncertain currents of the room without the anchor of his presence. As they came to a stop, he bent his head slightly. "Thank you, Lady Evelyn," he said, "for the dance, and for your candor." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, "for much more than a dance." His gaze held hers for a heartbeat longer. "This will not be the last time we speak tonight," he said quietly, "if you are willing." Something in his tone suggested it was less a question than a promise. Still, she inclined her head. "I am willing," she said. He released her hand at last, bowing, then stepped back, enough to give her space, but not so far that the connection between them dissolved entirely. For the moment he did not vanish into the crowd. He remained within sight, speaking briefly with a nobleman who approached, but his attention, she sensed, never drifted far from her. Evelyn turned, her breath still not quite steady. Cassandra stood where they had left her, a brittle smile fixed upon her face. Lord Percival, she now saw, had joined her at some point during the scene. He lounged at her side, his expression one of amused curiosity tinged with disbelief, as though he had just witnessed a play whose ending he had not anticipated. "Impressive, cousin," Cassandra said at last, the effort it cost her to maintain her airy tone evident in the tightness around her eyes. "I must say you have a talent for surprises." Evelyn regarded her calmly. "Not at all," she said. "You were the one determined to draw attention, Cassandra. I merely followed where you led." A flicker of anger passed over Cassandra's face, gone almost before it appeared. Lord Percival bowed slightly, his expression full of a charm that had long since lost its power to move her. "Lady Evelyn," he said with the faintest trace of a smirk, I had not realized you aimed quite so high. A duke, no less. My congratulations." She met his gaze without a flicker. Once his words would have pierced straight through her. Now they slid off the armor she had painstakingly forged. "Aim?" she repeated mildly. "You mistake me, my lord. I did not aim at all. His Grace chose to speak when others chose only to watch. That says much of him. As for me," she let her gaze drift over Percival and Cassandra, from the gleam of his cufflinks to the tension in her cousin's jaw. "I have long since learned that some prizes are best left to those who value them." For the first time it was Percival who flushed. She inclined her head without waiting for a reply and moved away, her steps sure and unhurried as the musicians began another tune. The night was far from over. There would be more dances, more conversations, more subtle tests. Questions would bloom like frost patterns in the corners of the ballroom. Why had the Duke called her "my Duchess"? Was there an understanding, a proposal in the making? Or had it been a singular gallant gesture and nothing more? Evelyn did not yet know the answer, but as she crossed the room beneath the gleam of candles and the watchful eyes of society, with the scent of pine and beeswax wrapping around her like an invisible mantle, she felt something shift inside her. Not a sudden fairy tale transformation, but the first quiet crack in a long frozen river. For years the world had mocked her for waiting. Tonight, in a room hung with evergreen and gold, under the gaze of a man who had chosen his moment with deliberate care, she began to suspect that she had not been waiting in vain. The rest of the evening unfolded beneath a sky of crystal and gold. After that first waltz, nothing in the ballroom felt quite the same. The music continued, couples danced, laughter rose and fell in waves, but the axis on which the night turned had shifted. Whispers looped through the air like ribbons threaded between evergreen boughs. "The Duke of Everthorne. Did you hear what he called her? My Duchess. Right there, in front of everyone. Lady Evelyn Ashford, of all people. I had thought—" "You had thought she would fade into the wallpaper forever, no doubt. No one will say still without a husband quite so easily now." The gossip did not reach Evelyn word for word, but she felt its presence in the way people looked at her, no longer with bored indifference or easy pity, but with sharp new interest. Some glances held calculation, some curiosity, a surprising few genuine respect. Cassandra's expression, meanwhile, had settled into a brittle composure, like ice stretched thin over dark water. Lord Percival lingered near her, but even he seemed somewhat distracted, as though he had discovered that the play in which he thought himself a main character had suddenly recast its leads without consulting him. For Evelyn, the room became a strange mixture of familiar discomfort and unfamiliar possibility. The humiliation she had braced herself to endure had been neatly deflected, almost casually, by a man she had just met. Yet she knew her victory, if it could be called that, would be incomplete and fragile if she rested all its weight upon one gallant gesture. There would be life after this ball. There would be days without chandeliers and royal notes and waltzes with dukes. She needed, for her own sake, to walk out of this night with more than borrowed radiance. But for now, there was the music, and there was him. The Duke did not vanish into the crowd as some men of his rank might have done, satisfied with one dramatic appearance. He did not, as Cassandra might have expected, claim his moment and then leave Evelyn to navigate the aftermath alone. Instead, throughout the evening he returned to her side with quiet consistency. He requested a second dance after a respectable interval, a country dance this time, where their hands met and parted in the figures, a different sort of conversation carried on through movement and rhythm. Later, he escorted her to the refreshments table, where they stood together for a few minutes away from the heaviest crush, the scent of spiced wine and sugared almonds thick in the air. "It seems," he remarked in a low voice, "that we have given the room something to talk about for Christmas." Evelyn took a sip of her mulled wine, the warmth of cinnamon and clove curling down into her chest. "I dare say they would have found something regardless. The tongue does not lack for imagination." "True," he conceded. "I only hope I have not burdened you further by interrupting as I did." She glanced up at him, surprised. "You think you burdened me?" "I inserted myself into a long-standing conflict without asking whether you desired such intervention, he said. Some people take offense at rescues they did not request. Her lips curved faintly, and some are grateful for them all the same. He studied her face as if weighing the truth of that. When I spoke, he said slowly, I did so for 2 reasons. The first, as I said, is that I have little patience for those who use another's vulnerabilities as sport. And the second? She prompted. The second, he answered, is that I have spent a great many years surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Favor, influence, wealth, a title to adorn their name. It is rare to encounter someone whose posture suggests she expects very little from the world anymore, and rarer still to see that person stand her ground when provoked. He paused. I wanted to see what you would do, if handed an unexpected opportunity to step forward. Evelyn thought of that moment, the hush, his outstretched hand, Cassandra's stunned face. I accepted, she said. You did, he replied, without fluster, without hesitation. You placed your hand in mine as if you had every right to do so. A flicker of warmth touched his eyes. I approve of that. She could not help a small laugh. I confess I did not feel entirely as composed as I may have appeared. Composure is rarely about what one feels, he said. It is about what one chooses to display. Her gaze drifted over the crowd, then back to him. And what do you choose to display tonight, Your Grace, beyond gallantry and a sudden enthusiasm for waltzes? He considered the question with an earnestness that caught her off guard. I choose, he said at last, to allow the possibility that the course of a life may change in a single evening, even after one has convinced oneself that such things happen only to the young and foolish. The admission hung between them like a fragile ornament. Before she could respond, Lord Ashford approached, his eyes bright and a touch misty. Your Grace, he said, bowing slightly, may I thank you for your kindness to my daughter? You owe me no thanks, my lord, the Duke replied. Lady Evelyn has earned all consideration by her own conduct. Lord Ashford's hand rested lightly on his cane, fingers tightening with emotion. Even so, he said, there have been difficult years. To see her stand as she did tonight and to see it recognized, well, he cleared his throat. It will be a better Christmas in Ashford House than I had dared hope. Evelyn's heart gave a small, painful twist of affection. Her father had seen more than she realized. He had carried her pain with his own quiet sorrow. The Duke's expression softened. Then I am glad, he said simply. The season should bring such things, if it is to mean anything at all. The night wore on. The royal couple retired earlier than their guests, leaving the ballroom to shimmer under slightly less formal scrutiny. The dances grew a touch freer, the conversations looser. Gentlemen who had been shy at the evening's start found their courage. Ladies whose feathers had been ruffled smoothed them. At one point, needing a breath of cooler air, Evelyn stepped onto a small balcony just off the ballroom. The night outside was still, the sky a deep velvet scattered with stars. The courtyard below glittered faintly with frost. The great fir tree's candles had been extinguished, leaving its dark shape outlined only by the ambient light from the windows. She wrapped her arms around herself, inhaling the crisp cold. Inside, the music was a muffled swell. Out here, the world felt momentarily suspended, like a snow globe paused mid-shake. Too warm inside? A voice asked softly behind her. She turned. The Duke stood in the doorway, the light from the ballroom framing him in a soft halo. He had removed his gloves, holding them loosely in one hand. A little, she admitted. One forgets how crowded these rooms can feel until one steps away. May I join you? He asked. Or will I only add to the crowding? You may join me, she said, on the condition that you agree not to talk of me as if I were a puzzle to be solved or a cause to be championed. His mouth curved. What shall we speak of then? She glanced back at the stars. Christmas, perhaps, or snow, or anything that does not revolve around Lady Cassandra Whitmore's opinion of my marital status. He stepped fully onto the balcony, closing the door most of the way behind him, leaving only a narrow gap through which music and warmth slipped. Very well, he said. Christmas, then. He leaned his forearms lightly upon the stone balustrade, looking out over the courtyard. "Do you love it?" She thought about the question more seriously than most would. "I used to," she said slowly. "When I was younger, it meant anticipation. Presents hidden in cupboards, secrets whispered between the servants, the house slowly transforming with greenery and candles. Later, after everything, it became something different. An echo of what might have been. A reminder of where I was meant to be by now, according to society's clock." She exhaled, watching her breath mist in the cold. "In the last few years, I have tried to think of it instead as a pause, a chance to take stock, to be grateful for what remains, rather than mourn what never came." He listened without interruption, his profile calm and intent. "And you?" she asked. "Do you love Christmas, Your Grace?" "When I was a boy," he said, "I loved it fiercely. Everthorne Hall would fill with cousins and uncles, the great hall hung with so much greenery you could scarcely see the stone. My father would insist on a great Yule log. My mother would direct the placement of every candle on the tree. There was noise, laughter, chaos." His gaze drifted far beyond the courtyard to some northern landscape only he could see. "Then there was a year when none of that happened. Illness has a way of silencing even the noisiest of houses. After that, Christmas became quieter, more formal. The servants tried, but one cannot manufacture what is gone." The faint roughness in his voice told her more than the words themselves. "I am sorry," she said softly. He shook his head once. "It is long past. One learns to live with absences. But—" He paused, as if testing the shape of the thought before speaking it aloud. "Being here tonight, seeing your father's face when he spoke of Christmas at Ashford House, it reminded me that not all traditions have to fade. Some can be rebuilt elsewhere, with different people." She turned that over carefully. "Do you mean," she asked, "that you have been spending Christmas alone?" "Not entirely alone," he corrected. "There are always retainers, tenants, those one invites out of duty or kindness. But in the sense that matters, yes. For several years now." She considered him in the starlight, the powerful Duke, surrounded by wealth and deference, and yet standing here speaking of emptiness with the quiet of someone unused to pity. "That seems a waste," she said gently. "Thou've a good hearth and a fine house." He looked at her then, really looked, as if the jest had struck deeper than she realized. "Perhaps," he said. "The question is whether it might be put to better use." Silence settled between them again, not uncomfortable but full, like the hush of snow before it begins to fall. "Lady Evelyn," he said at last, turning to face her more directly, "I must apologize in one sense for the words I chose earlier this evening." She blinked. "Apologize?" "I called you my Duchess in a moment of impulse," he said. "It was, as you know, not strictly accurate. I overstepped propriety. I did not intend to trap you in speculation you did not invite." "You also silenced a humiliation I have endured for years," she replied quietly. "If that is overstepping, I find I am not offended." His lips curved slightly, then straightened. "Still," he continued, "I am not a man who enjoys leaving important matters to implication and gossip. I prefer clarity. So if you can forgive the bluntness, I would rather adjust my words than retreat from them." Her heart gave a hard, startled thud. The night seemed to grow sharper around the edges, the starlight more keen. "Adjust them how?" she asked, her voice barely carrying. He held her gaze, every trace of courtly detachment gone. "By asking," he said, "whether you would ever consider making them true." The words seemed to hang in the cold air like a visible breath. She stared at him, the meaning settling slowly like snowflakes finding their place on still ground. "You mean," she managed. "I mean," he said, "that I find myself after one evening in your company entirely unwilling to let the matter remain at the level of clever phrasing. I am not given to sudden infatuations, Lady Evelyn. I do not propose rashly, but I am also not so arrogant as to assume that years of knowing a person are required before recognizing something solid in them." He drew a slow breath, as though speaking these words cost him more than facing a room of courtiers. "I have seen enough of your character tonight, your restraint, your courage, your refusal to bend to cruelty, to know that you are the sort of woman I would be proud to call my wife. I do not ask for an answer in this moment. To do so would be unjust, but I wish you to know that my words earlier were not a joke at your expense. If I were to offer for any woman, it would be for you." Her pulse roared in her ears like distant surf. All the years of waiting, of whispers and pity and Cassandra's jeers, seemed to narrow into this single point in time. A balcony cold enough that her breath fogged in the air, the muffled strains of a Christmas waltz behind her, and before her a man who had known her only hours, and yet spoke directly to the core of what she had always longed for: respect, partnership, something steadier than charm. "Your Grace," she began, then faltered. "Alexander," he said quietly. "If we are to speak of such things, you may as well use my name." "Alexander," she repeated, the syllables tasting unfamiliar and strangely right on her tongue. "Evelyn," he answered, equally soft, as if balancing the exchange. She drew a breath, trying to gather her scattered thoughts into something coherent. She paused, then smiled faintly at herself. "You are very thorough, Your Grace. Most men content themselves with flirtation and leave such clarity for solicitors." He huffed a brief, genuine laugh. "I am not most men, and I have no wish to leave your future in the hands of solicitors alone." "That is reassuring," she said, and it was. She turned to look out over the courtyard again, buying herself a few precious moments. When she had been a girl, she had imagined love would come like lightning, sudden, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. With Percival it had felt like that at first, dizzy, blinding, all blaze and no warmth. And then the storm had passed, leaving devastation behind. What she felt now was different. There was no dizzy rush, no romantic delirium. There was instead a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place with a quiet click. Here was a man who had stepped forward not because he saw a prize to display, but because he saw an injustice to oppose. A man who spoke plainly, who admitted loneliness without fishing for sympathy, who valued character over spectacle. Did she love him? Not yet. Not in the sense of poems and songs and those foolish tales that promised everything in an instant. But love, she had come to suspect, was less about one thunderclap moment than about the person one chose to stand beside when storms came. She turned back to him. "I cannot give you an answer this instant," she said. "Not one that would be worthy of the seriousness with which you ask, but I can tell you this. For the first time in many years, I look at a man and think that perhaps waiting was not a mistake." Something eased in his features, tension unknitting like frost under sunlight. "That is more than I had any right to expect tonight," he said. She smiled, genuine and small. "Tomorrow," she said slowly, "my father and I will receive callers at Ashford House, as is our custom in the days before Christmas. We drink chocolate and pretend not to see when the servants sneak extra biscuits. If you wish to call, to speak properly." He bowed his head slightly as if receiving a royal decree. "Then I shall present myself at a respectable hour," he said, "and likely scandalize your servants by refusing more than 2 biscuits. "They will forgive you," she replied, "if you admire the tree and say something nice about the plum pudding." "I shall prepare my compliments," he said gravely. They stood for a moment longer, stars above them, Christmas warmth at their backs, the words between them not yet a promise but the shape of one. "Come," he said at last, "if we linger much longer, half the ton will assume we have eloped on the balcony." She laughed, the sound lighter than she had heard it in years. "We must not deprive them of their favorite game, wild speculation based on inadequate information. Let us give them just enough," he said, offering his arm, "to keep them amused through 12th night." She laid her hand upon his sleeve, and together they re-entered the ballroom. The remainder of the evening passed in a kind of suspended anticipation. Evelyn danced a few more times, with other partners as well as with the Duke, aware that each choice was watched and weighed. She spoke with old acquaintances, who now regarded her with a new carefulness, unsure how close they dared stand to the orbit of Everthorne. She endured Cassandra's simmering glances with a calm that surprised even herself. At one point, she saw Percival attempting to approach, no doubt intending to reclaim some fragment of relevance in her story. The Duke, who had been standing not far away, intercepted him with a courtesy so impeccably polite and so unyielding that Percival was forced to retreat with a laugh that rang hollow. By the time the final dances ended and the guests began to depart, the air in the ballroom held the languid warmth of a fire about to burn down. Candles dripped the last of their wax, musicians stretched and put away their instruments. Outside, the night remained clear and cold, the stars sharp as pinpricks. In the carriage on the way home, Lord Ashford sat very quietly for several minutes. Evelyn watched the play of light and shadow across his face, the reflection of passing lanterns tracing lines carved by years of care and perseverance. "Well," he said at last, breaking the silence, "that was not the evening I had anticipated." "No," Evelyn agreed. "Nor I." He looked at her more directly. "Do you care for him?" She considered how to answer. "I respect him deeply," she said. "I trust him more than I expected to trust anyone after such a short time. And I feel," she searched for the word, "safe in his presence without feeling invisible. That seems a good beginning." Lord Ashford nodded slowly. "It does indeed." A faint, hopeful light entered his eyes. "Your mother," he said, almost to himself, "would have liked him, I think. She always said a man's true worth is shown in how he behaves when no one expects anything of him." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Then I am glad," she said softly. "Wherever she is, I hope she had a good view of the ballroom tonight." They fell into a companionable silence, carriage wheels crunching over the frost-hardened road, the sounds of distant carols drifting on the night. The next morning London was quieter, as if the city itself had drawn a breath after the brilliance of the ball. At Ashford House, the day began with the familiar rituals Evelyn had come to love despite everything. A simple breakfast with her father, the servants bustling with barely contained excitement, the scent of baking and spices seeping through the walls. The drawing room had been arranged for callers. The Christmas tree stood in its usual place, branches hung with ribbons, tiny glass baubles, and hand-carved wooden ornaments from years past. A fire crackled merrily, garlands draped over the mantel and along the doorframes. A tray of cups and a large steaming pot of chocolate waited upon the side table, accompanied by plates of biscuits and slices of fruit cake. Evelyn straightened a ribbon on the tree, smoothing a slightly crooked bow. "You have done that 3 times now," her father observed from his chair, amusement in his voice. "It will not stay in place," she said, though they both knew the ribbon was fine. "You are not nervous?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "It feels odd to anticipate a caller in earnest again." He nodded. "It is natural. But no matter what happens, my dear, know this. You have already reclaimed something tonight. Cassandra's words have lost their power. Whether ever you marry or no, you have shown them all that your worth was never theirs to decide." She crossed to him and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, Papa." They did not have to wait long. The knock upon the door was firm and punctual, as the clock on the mantel chimed 11. A moment later, the butler appeared in the doorway. "Your lordship," he said, with a gravity tinged by barely contained curiosity. "His Grace, the Duke of Everthorne." "Show him in," Lord Ashford replied, managing to keep his voice even. The Duke entered dressed not in full evening splendour, but in a dark, well-cut day coat and a waistcoat of deep green that subtly echoed the season. Snow dusted the shoulders of his coat. The air around him held the faint chill of the outdoors, quickly warmed by the glow of the room. "Your Grace," Lord Ashford greeted, rising with his cane. "Welcome to Ashford House." "Thank you, my lord," Alexander said. His gaze moved to Evelyn, and a softness entered his features that had not been present at the palace. "Lady Evelyn." "Your Grace," she said, curtsying. "We are honoured by your visit. Please do sit. Will you take chocolate?" "I would be delighted," he replied. "It is, after all, Christmas. One must observe the rituals." As he accepted a cup and a modest number of biscuits, 2, as promised, conversation began formally enough. They spoke of the ball, of the king's evident satisfaction with the evening, of the surprising resilience of the palace decorations given so many guests. Slowly, the talk turned more personal. Alexander spoke of Everthorne Hall, the great fires, the long gallery with its portraits, the small chapel where carols echoed hauntingly against stone at midnight services. Evelyn and her father described their own traditions, the exchanging of modest gifts on Christmas morning, the distribution of baskets to the poor in their parish, the way the staff gathered in the kitchen on Christmas Eve for mulled cider and songs. "At Everthorne," Alexander said quietly, "the Great Hall has been underused at Christmastide in recent years. It would be pleasant to see it full again, with laughter, with family." Lord Ashford glanced between them, then set his cup down with deliberate care. "Your Grace," he said, "I'm an old man, not inclined to waste words when the important ones need saying. Last night, you honored my daughter before the highest in the land. Today, you honor our home. May I ask plainly what your intentions are toward Evelyn?" There it was, simple, direct, the question that had hung unspoken in the air. Alexander did not flinch. He set his own cup aside and met Lord Ashford's gaze squarely. "My intentions, my lord," he said, "are as earnest as any I have ever declared. I wish, with your permission and her consent, to offer for Lady Evelyn's hand. I do not ask for an immediate answer. I understand the magnitude of what I propose. But I would consider it the greatest of Christmas blessings if, in due time, she were willing to be my wife." Silence stretched for a heartbeat, filled with the crackle of the fire and the faint clink of cooling china. Lord Ashford turned to his daughter. "Evelyn?" he asked softly. She took a breath, feeling the weight and lightness of the moment all at once. She thought of every Christmas she had spent feeling like a figure left out of a tableau, of every still without a husband that had cut away at her confidence. She thought of the Duke's hand extended in the ballroom, of his quiet honesty on the balcony, of the way he now sat in their drawing room seeing her. Not a trophy, not a rescue project, but a woman whose answer mattered in its own right. She looked at her father, at the hope and concern in his eyes. Then she looked at Alexander. "I have been asked that question about marriage many times in many ways," she said, her voice steady. "Usually indirectly, usually wrapped in gossip or pity. I made a promise to myself, some years ago, that I would never again accept less than respect dressed as love." She held his gaze. "In you, Your Grace, Alexander, I find a man who respects me first, who stepped forward not to polish his own reputation, but to shield what little peace I had managed to build. I do not know you fully yet. You do not know me fully either. But I believe we could. And I believe that in time, what begins as respect and partnership could grow into the sort of love that does not burn out when the season ends." Her father's eyes shone. "And so," she finished, allowing a small, radiant smile to break through, "if you are truly asking, my answer is yes." Relief and something like wonder flickered across Alexander's face. The reserve that had so often guarded his features softened, revealing a warmth that made him, in that moment, less the untouchable Duke and more a man simply, deeply grateful. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You honor me more than you know." Lord Ashford rose, his cane forgotten for a moment as he took Alexander's hand in a firm grip. "Then it is settled," he said, voice rough with emotion. "We shall have a wedding and a Christmas worth remembering." Alexander turned to Evelyn once more, and though propriety limited what he could do in that moment, the look they shared was almost as intimate as any embrace. Outside, carolers passed along the street, their voices rising in a familiar hymn about joy and redemption. The sound filtered through the windows, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the murmur of their voices. In the weeks that followed, society did what society always did. It talked, speculated, picked apart timelines and motives. Some were convinced it had all been arranged in advance. Others declared it a miracle of Christmastide, proof that patience and virtue were eventually rewarded. Cassandra's fury, when the official announcement was made, was the stuff of hushed hilarity in drawing rooms for months. Her favorite refrain, "Still without a husband," disappeared abruptly from her vocabulary, as unconsciously as if it had never existed. Lord Percival, finding himself suddenly less sought after than the Duke, drifted among lesser invitations, his charm increasingly applied in circles that cared more for parties than for honor. In time, his name faded into the background noise of scandal columns, the sort of man people remembered vaguely as that charming fellow who never quite amounted to anything. Evelyn, meanwhile, found her life slowly rethreading itself around new patterns. There were letters back and forth between London and Everthorne Hall, pages filled not with overflowing declarations, but with the careful weaving of two lives' histories. Childhood memories, favourite books, fears quietly confessed, hopes tentatively outlined. There were visits always chaperoned, but with enough small moments to allow glances and half-finished sentences that spoke of growing tenderness. As winter deepened and then softened toward early spring, the wedding was planned, not a gaudy spectacle but a celebration that blended the grace of the aristocracy with the warmth of a cherished holiday. Evelyn chose colours inspired by holly and snow. Alexander insisted that the great hall at Everthorne be decorated with more greenery than it had seen in years. On the day they were wed, snow fell in delicate flakes outside the small chapel at Everthorne. Candles lined the aisle, their flames steady, as if even the draughts of an old stone building respected the importance of the moment. Lord Ashford walked his daughter toward the man waiting at the altar, his hand trembling just enough that she squeezed it once, reassuring him as much as herself. When Alexander spoke his vows, his voice did not carry the dramatic flourish some might have desired. It was low, firm, and intensely sincere. Evelyn's own vows matched his in simplicity and strength. And when they stepped out of the chapel afterward, husband and wife at last. The bells tolled through the cold air, scattering their music over snow-dusted fields. That evening, Everthorne Hall glowed with what the servants would later swear was a light they had not seen there in decades. Fires blazed in hearths. The great hall was filled with greenery, candles and laughter. Tenants and villagers joined in the feast, their presence as important to the newlyweds as that of any titled guest. At one point, as the night wore on and the musicians struck up a familiar waltz with hints of a Christmas carol woven through it, Alexander took Evelyn's hand and led her to the centre of the hall. "May I have this dance?" he murmured, his eyes alight. "My Duchess." This time the title belonged to her entirely. She smiled, heart full, and stepped into his arms. As they turned together beneath garlands and candlelight, she caught sight of her father at the edge of the room, his eyes shining with satisfaction. Beyond him, in a shadowed corner where garlands brushed ancient stone, she could almost imagine the figure of her mother watching too, hands clasped, face radiant. Later still, when the guests had departed and the fires had burned low to a comforting glow, Evelyn stood with Alexander at one of the long windows overlooking the grounds. Snow fell outside, turning the world into a soft white hush. Inside, the tree glittered with the last reflections of candlelight, its ornaments swaying gently in the draughts. "Do you still think Christmas is a pause?" Alexander asked, his arm around her, drawing her close. She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "No," she said. "Not anymore." "What is it then?" he asked. She watched the snowflakes drift past the glass, felt the warmth of his side beneath her cheek, heard the faint echo of distant carols carried on the wind. "A beginning," she said, "for both of us." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Then let us begin well, my Duchess." Outside the snow fell, covering the old tracks of lonely winters with a clean, new layer. Inside, beneath garlands and the memory of bells, two people who had once stared at empty Christmases now held a future that felt as bright and steady as a candle cupped in careful hands. The world had mocked Evelyn for waiting, but she had not waited for any man. She had waited without quite knowing it for the right one, and for the courage to claim a life that was hers in truth, not in the eyes of gossip, but in the warmth of a shared hearth and a love strong enough to silence every shadow of winter.